The day Major Rachel Donovan arrived at the forward operating base in eastern Afghanistan, the sky was the color of old concrete and the wind was throwing dust across the tarmac in long sideways sheets. Nobody met her at the aircraft. That was fine. She had not expected a welcome party. She had expected exactly what she got: a base running at full operational tempo, completely indifferent to new arrivals, focused entirely on the work in front of it. She grabbed her gear bag, tucked her flight helmet under one arm, and walked across the flight line alone. She had been flying the A-10 Thunderbolt for 9 years. She had thousands of hours in that aircraft. She had flown combat missions over Iraq. She had fired the gun in real situations. She had dropped bombs on targets that needed destroying and had pulled away from targets when the situation on the ground changed fast and the strike was no longer safe. She was 34 years old, and she was very good at her job in the way that people who have given their entire professional lives to one aircraft become good, which is to say, she was not just technically skilled, but deeply and instinctively connected to the machine, to its sounds, its movements, its moods, and its limits. None of that was visible to the people at the base when she walked in. What was visible was that she was a woman, that she was new, and that she was being assigned as the primary close air support asset for a SEAL team that had been working this area for 7 months. That team had developed very specific ideas about what they needed from the air and who could actually deliver it under the worst possible conditions. The SEAL team she would be supporting had a reputation built not on stories but on results. They had completed missions in terrain that other units had studied and walked away from. They had reached targets through valleys that looked impassable on any map. They had the kind of quiet, sustained operational record that only develops when a group of skilled people have been working together long enough to stop thinking as individuals and start functioning as a single unit. They trusted each other the way you trust a limb, automatically, completely, without conscious thought. Their senior leader was a man named Senior Chief Petty Officer Danny Hargrove. He was 41, had been a SEAL for 16 years, and had the kind of face that gave away very little unless he chose to let it. He had the thick forearms of someone who had spent those 16 years doing exactly what his body was built for. He had worked with many pilots. He had formed very clear opinions about pilots. Those opinions were not based on bias or assumption. They were based entirely on what he had seen happen when the moment of truth arrived. When Hargrove met Major Donovan that first afternoon in the operations center, he was polite. He shook her hand. He introduced her to the key members of the team. He walked her through the current intelligence picture, the mission boards, the overlay maps of the northeastern valleys where they operated most frequently. He did all of this correctly and professionally, but behind the professional manner, behind the measured words and the neutral expression, there was something else: a deep and well-earned skepticism about whether this new pilot was going to be able to do what his team needed when the moment finally came. That skepticism was not irrational. It was not the product of prejudice or stubbornness. It was the specific, evidence-based doubt of a man who had watched 3 different pilots over 7 months face the same critical moment in the same difficult terrain and make the same decision. All 3 had been competent. All 3 had records that looked impressive on paper. All 3 had assessed the low-level approach in the northeastern valleys as too dangerous at the altitude required to be genuinely effective, and had either disengaged entirely or had worked from a higher, safer altitude where their accuracy was technically acceptable but operationally not enough. One of those disengagements had consequences that Hargrove could not set aside. A target that should have been destroyed had escaped into the mountains. 3 weeks later, that same target was involved in an attack on a convoy from a different unit. 2 soldiers died. Hargrove had known one of them personally, a young man from Georgia who had a wife and a daughter he talked about constantly. He had attended the memorial. He had stood there and thought about the valley and the approach that had not been flown. So when he looked at Major Donovan across the operations table, he was not seeing her as an individual yet. He was seeing her as the 4th pilot in a sequence that had produced 3 identical outcomes. And he was trying, honestly and without malice, to determine whether there was any reason to expect a different result. He found it very hard to see one. Donovan could feel the weight of that skepticism in the room. She had been feeling different versions of it throughout her career. At flight school, in her first operational assignment, every time she walked into a room full of people who had not yet seen what she could do, she had learned years ago that arguing against doubt with words was useless. The doubt was not unreasonable, and more importantly, words proved nothing. The only thing that ever actually moved people was performance. You showed up. You did the work. You let the work answer the question. She asked smart questions during the briefing. Not too many, which would have looked like she was overwhelmed. Not too few, which would have looked like she was not paying attention. She asked about the specific terrain features in the operational valleys, the width measurements at critical choke points, the elevation changes along the most common approach vectors, the locations of known enemy positions relative to the canyon walls. She asked about the previous missions, not in a way that criticized the previous pilots, but in a way that made clear she was trying to understand exactly what the terrain demanded and where the assessments of impossibility had come from. Two members of the team noticed the quality of her questions. One of them, a quiet operator named Teller, who had been on all 3 previous missions, mentioned it later to his partner. He said she was asking the right things. His partner shrugged and said that asking the right questions was one thing, and flying the approach was something completely different. After the briefing, Donovan went back to the aircraft. She had already done a standard pre-flight earlier. Now, she did something else. She accessed the targeting pod storage and called up the recorded imagery from previous operational flights in the northeastern valleys. She spent 3 hours going through that footage frame by frame, watching the canyon walls come up on either side as the previous pilots descended, watching the decision points where the approach was still committed, watching the moments where the abort call was made and the aircraft climbed away. She was not watching to judge those pilots. She was watching to find the precise altitude where the approach became unflyable, and to determine whether that altitude and the altitude the previous pilots had chosen to stop at were actually the same number. Because if there was a gap between them, even a small one, that gap was the information she needed. She found the gap at around 11 o'clock that night, when the base had gone quiet and the only sound was the wind picking up outside and the distant hum of a generator. The previous pilots had been stopping well above the point where the approach became genuinely impossible. Their decision point was conservative, which was understandable. Conservative decisions in complex terrain were rational decisions. But conservative was not the same as necessary, and the gap between their abort altitude and the actual edge of the envelope was real. It was not large, but it was there. She double-checked her calculations. Then she checked them again. Then she sat with the numbers for a long time, not looking for confirmation, but looking for the flaw, the thing she had missed, the variable she had failed to account for. She found nothing. The approach was flyable, not comfortable, not easy, not the kind of thing you could do on a medium day when your focus was at 70%, but flyable by someone who knew this aircraft the way she knew it, who understood the exact margins and the exact control inputs required, and who did not hesitate at the wrong moment. She went to sleep with that knowledge sitting quietly inside her. She did not share it with anyone. There was nothing to share. Yet, analysis was not proof. The proof would come when she flew the approach, and the approach did what she said it would do. In the team's common area, Hargrove was still awake, sitting at the table with the cup of coffee he had stopped drinking 20 minutes ago, looking at the mission maps. 2 of his men, Reyes and Calloway, were with him. Reyes was saying that they should give the new pilot a fair chance before forming any conclusions. Calloway was saying that 3 pilots had already shown them what the terrain produced when it came down to the real moment, and that credentials and a flight record were not the same as being able to hold. The next 2 days before the mission were a different kind of test, quieter than combat, but in some ways more demanding because there was nothing yet to point at and say, "This is what I can do." Everything was still theoretical. Everything was still a question mark. And in that space of uncertainty, every small thing, every interaction, every question asked or not asked, every decision made about how to spend an hour was being watched and evaluated by people who had learned to read character very accurately because their lives depended on accurate readings. Donovan spent the first full day on the ground doing 3 things. The first was a detailed weapons systems check that went beyond what the standard pre-flight required. The A-10 she had been assigned was not the aircraft she had been flying at her previous base. It was a different airframe, maintained by a different crew chief, with its own particular history and its own small quirks. She needed to know those quirks before she flew the mission, because a surprise in the cockpit during a low-level gun run in a mountain valley was not the kind of surprise that allowed for recovery time. She spent 4 hours with the aircraft and its crew chief, a young sergeant named Williams, who had clearly not expected a pilot to spend this much time with him, and who by the end of the 4 hours had developed a visible respect for the thoroughness she brought to the process. The second thing she did was sit down with the intelligence officer attached to the team, a captain named Farouk, who had been working the Northeastern Valley network for 5 months and who knew the terrain and the enemy behavior in it better than anyone else on the base. She asked him about the specific patterns of enemy movement in the target valley, where they positioned during daylight, how they used the overhangs and the shallow depressions in the canyon walls, how much warning they typically had before an aircraft was inbound. She was not asking questions that the briefing had already answered. She was asking the follow-up questions that the briefing had left open. The granular specifics that determined whether a gun run in that terrain was going to hit anything worth hitting. Farouk answered every question fully. He was thorough and organized in the way that good intelligence officers are thorough and organized. And he noticed, after about 20 minutes, that she was not just gathering data, but actively integrating it into a model of the problem, asking questions whose answers informed the next questions in a chain of reasoning that was clearly leading somewhere specific. He found this unusual, and said so. Most pilots asked about the target and the threat. She was asking about the target and the threat and the geometry of the space between them and the aircraft, which was a different level of engagement with the problem. The third thing she did that first day was find the 2 ground controllers who would be managing the terminal control during the mission, the men who would be on the ridge with the SEAL team, talking her onto the target from a position where they could see both the aircraft and the aim point. Their names were Petty Officer Cruz and Petty Officer Nakamura. They were experienced, professional, and they had been through the previous 3 missions. They had given the exact same terminal guidance to the previous 3 pilots, and had watched all 3 of them execute different versions of the same abort. She did not ask them about that directly. She did not want to put them in a position of criticizing their previous experiences or the pilots who had made those decisions. Instead, she asked them about the communication itself, the specific language they used at each stage of the approach, the way they called out range and bearing and aim point adjustments, the timing of the clearance to fire call relative to the visual acquisition of the target. She walked through the entire communication sequence with them 3 times, until the protocol was as natural as a conversation. Cruz and Nakamura exchanged a look during the 3rd run-through. It was a look that meant something between them, the specific look of 2 people who have both noticed the same thing, and are both deciding what to do with that noticing. They did not say anything about it to each other until that evening, when they were alone. Cruz said she was different from the others. Nakamura said he was not ready to say that yet. Cruz said he was